This is HOA Meltdown Moments. I saved every receipt and every timestamp. You are in non-compliance, and I am submitting it. Karen yelled that my car was the problem and she was the solution. She stood in front of my sedan with a clipboard pressed against her chest and a stack of orange cones tucked under her other arm like she had just won a prize. The tow truck was already backing into the guest parking spot behind me, amber lights flashing across the pavement. I had about 90 seconds before the hook went on, and I had to leave for work at a hard start time. Karen was timing the tow threat to trap me. My name is Derek. I live in Maplewood Commons Terrace Association in Beaverton, Oregon, and I work for the City Parks Department. I know permits and right-of-way rules inside and out. The stakes here were simple. I was trying to keep my neighborhood reputation clean, and the HOA was smearing me with fabricated violations and escalating harassment. Karen Jones was the pool and amenities chair, and she controlled access like a bouncer. She had been on my case for 3 weeks, ever since I parked a friend's car in the guest lot overnight. The first violation notice showed up on my door 3 weeks ago. It was a bright orange door hanger with a printed grid of checkboxes and a handwritten note at the bottom. No signature, no date, just a list of alleged infractions. Guest vehicle parked overnight without a pass. Failure to display a current resident decal. Obstruction of fire lane access. None of it was true. My friend had parked in a marked guest spot. I had a valid decal on my windshield, and the fire lane was 2 rows over. I took photos of everything and submitted a dispute to the management company. 2 days later, another orange hanger appeared. This one claimed my car was parked in a reserved spot. I drove a 15-year-old sedan that I kept in my assigned carport. The hanger was clearly meant for someone else, but it had my unit number on it. I called the management office and got voicemail. I emailed and got an auto reply. I walked to the HOA office near the clubhouse and found a sign taped to the door that said the manager was out for the week. Karen caught me in the parking lot that same afternoon. She was wearing a gray blazer and a gray sun hat, and she had a handheld scanner in one hand and a clipboard in the other. She pointed the scanner at my license plate and clicked a button. Nothing happened. She clicked it again, then slapped the clipboard against my hood. "I do not care what you think, I care what the rule says," she said. Her voice was clipped and cold. "Your vehicle is not in compliance. You have 72 hours to correct it, or we initiate towing." I asked her what violation she was talking about. She tapped the clipboard and said my guest had overstayed the 48-hour limit. I told her my friend had left after one night. She said the log showed otherwise. I asked to see the log. She said it was proprietary HOA information and I could request it through the formal records process. That was when I realized she was making it up as she went. The HOA had a formal violation process that required photos, dates, and a chance to respond before any fines or towing. Karen was skipping all of that. She was writing complaints in her own voice, printing them on official letterhead, and slapping them on doors. A complaint log entry that was obviously written in her voice became my first piece of evidence. I started photographing every notice, every email, every interaction. The management company finally called me back a week later. They said they had reviewed my file and found no violations. I asked about the orange hangers. The woman on the phone said those were not official notices and I should disregard them. I asked who was distributing them. She said she could not comment on internal matters. I asked if Karen was acting alone. She said the board had authorized increased compliance monitoring due to resident complaints. I asked who complained. She hung up. I kept my plan quiet because the HOA depends on controlling the narrative. I knew Karen was escalating, and I knew the management company was covering for her. I needed proof that connected the harassment to something bigger. I started talking to neighbors. A delivery driver who covered our route told me he had seen Karen blocking the guest lot with cones during the day and moving them at night. A security guard named Marcus told me Karen had asked him to scan plates and report any vehicles without current decals, even though that was not his job. He was tired of being used as muscle, and he started documenting her requests in text messages. The second wave of escalation came 2 weeks in. I woke up one morning and found another orange hanger on my door. This one had a fabricated violation notice with altered dates and recycled photos. The photos were taken from a different angle than the ones I had submitted in my dispute. The dates were changed to make it look like my car had been parked in a guest spot for 5 consecutive nights. I recognized the lighting in the photos. They were taken during the same time frame as my original dispute photos, just cropped and relabeled. Karen had taken my own evidence and weaponized it. I filed a formal records request with the management company. I asked for all violation logs, photos, and correspondence related to my unit. I asked for the names of the board members who had authorized the increased compliance monitoring. I asked for the contract terms with the towing vendor. The management company had 30 days to respond under Oregon HOA law. They sent me a 2-page letter acknowledging my request and said they would provide documents within the statutory timeframe. Karen did not wait. She started showing up at my carport in the mornings, clipboard in hand, taking photos of my car from every angle. She measured the distance from my bumper to the carport post. She took photos of my gate fob held inches from the reader, her hand shaking like she was documenting a crime. She left notes on my windshield that said I was in violation of the guest parking policy, even though I was parked in my assigned spot. The notes were not official HOA letterhead. They were printed on plain paper with a laser printer, unsigned, undated. Marcus, the security guard, pulled me aside one night after his shift. He told me Karen had called the towing company 3 times in the past week, asking them to hook my car. The tow driver had refused each time because my car was in an assigned spot with a valid decal. Karen had offered to pay extra fees if the driver would hook first and ask questions never. The driver was uncomfortable with it and had told Marcus he was not going to risk his license for an HOA board member. Marcus said I should get that in writing before Karen found a more compliant tow vendor. I reached out to the tow driver through Marcus. His name was Ray, and he worked for a company called All Hours Towing. Ray agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near the neighborhood entrance. He brought his dispatch log and showed me the entries. 3 calls from the same HOA number, all requesting immediate towing for a vehicle in violation of guest parking rules. Each entry had my license plate number and my unit address. Ray said he had refused the jobs because the vehicle was clearly in an assigned spot, not a guest spot. He said Karen had called him back each time and told him to check again, that I was lying about my assigned space. Ray gave me printouts of the dispatch log entries. He said he was willing to testify if it came to that. He also told me something else. Karen had been calling other towing companies in the area, shopping for one that would take the job without asking questions. Ray had heard from another driver that Karen was offering a flat rate plus a percentage of the impound fees. That was illegal under Oregon towing regulations. Tow companies could not accept kickbacks or incentive payments from HOAs for non-emergency tows. I went back to the management company with Ray's printouts and demanded an emergency meeting with the board. The management company lost my dispute packet twice and acted like it was my fault. They said they had no record of my records request. I forwarded them the email confirmation with the timestamp. They said the email must have gone to spam. I asked to speak to the board president. They said the board president was unavailable and I would need to submit a written request for a hearing. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more wild HOA drama. The management company scheduled a hearing for 3 weeks out. Karen did not wait that long. She escalated to direct action. I woke up one morning and found a wheel clamp on my front tire. It was a bright yellow immobilizer with a padlock and a warning sticker that said the vehicle was in violation of HOA parking rules and would be towed within 24 hours if the fine was not paid. The sticker listed a fine amount, a processing fee, and a daily storage charge. The total was $850. I called the number on the sticker. A recorded message said I had reached the Maplewood Commons Terrace Association compliance hotline and I should leave a message with my unit number and a callback number. I called the management company. Voicemail. I called the police non-emergency line. The dispatcher said the HOA had the right to enforce parking rules on private property, and I would need to resolve it through the HOA hearing process. I explained that the clamp was placed on my assigned carport spot, not a guest spot. The dispatcher said she understood my frustration, but the police could not intervene in a civil HOA dispute unless there was evidence of a crime. I took photos of the clamp from every angle. I took photos of my carport number, my decal, the guest lot 2 rows over. I called Marcus and asked him to review the overnight security footage. He said the cameras in the carport area had been turned off for maintenance 2 days earlier. Karen had submitted a maintenance request claiming the cameras were malfunctioning and needed to be reset. Marcus said the cameras were working fine before the request. I had to get to work. My shift started at 7 in the morning and I could not be late. I had already used 2 personal days dealing with HOA complaints. My supervisor had made it clear that another absence would trigger a performance review. I tried to remove the clamp with a crowbar. The lock was hardened steel and the crowbar bent. I called a locksmith. He quoted me $300 for an emergency call and said he could not guarantee he could remove the clamp without damaging my tire. I called Ray, the tow driver. He said he could not remove an HOA-placed clamp without authorization from the HOA. I was trapped. Karen had timed it perfectly. The hearing was still 2 weeks away, the management company was not returning calls, and I had no way to get to work without my car. I walked to the clubhouse and pounded on the door. No answer. I walked to Karen's unit and knocked. She opened the door with a coffee mug in one hand and her phone in the other. "I will bury you in notices until you run out of printer ink," she said. She smiled when she said it. I told her I needed the clamp removed so I could get to work. She said I needed to pay the fine first. I told her I was parked in my assigned spot and there was no valid violation. She said the board had determined I was in non-compliance and the clamp would remain until I paid. I asked to see the board determination. She said it was documented in the minutes and I could request a copy through the records process. I went back to my unit and called an attorney. I found a lawyer in Portland who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Andrea, and she agreed to take my case on a consultation basis. I sent her everything: the orange hangers, the photos, the dispatch logs from Ray, the text messages from Marcus, the records request denial. She called me back that afternoon and said I had a strong case for harassment and improper enforcement. She said the wheel clamp was likely illegal because Oregon HOA law required notice and a hearing before any immobilization or towing action. She said I could file an emergency injunction to have the clamp removed, but it would take at least 3 days to get a court date. I did not have 3 days. I had to be at work the next morning. I called my supervisor and explained the situation. He was not sympathetic. He said I needed to figure it out or find a new job. I called a rideshare and paid $60 to get to work. When I got home that night, another orange hanger was on my door. This one said the vehicle had been immobilized for 72 hours and would be towed to impound at the owner's expense if the fine was not paid by the end of the week. Andrea, the attorney, filed the injunction the next morning. The court scheduled a hearing for 5 days out. In the meantime, I kept documenting. I walked the neighborhood every evening and took photos of other vehicles parked in guest spots overnight, vehicles without decals, vehicles parked in fire lanes. None of them had been clamped or cited. I collected witness statements from neighbors who had seen Karen distributing orange hangers and moving cones. I got a statement from the delivery driver who had seen Karen blocking the guest lot during the day. I got a statement from Marcus documenting Karen's requests to scan plates and report violations. The management company finally sent me a response to my records request. It was a 200-page PDF with half the pages redacted. The unredacted pages showed a pattern. Karen had filed 17 compliance complaints in the past 6 months, all targeting vehicles in guest parking or assigned spots near the clubhouse. None of the complaints had resulted in fines or towing, except for mine. The redacted pages were labeled as board deliberations and attorney-client privileged communications. Andrea said the redactions were improper and we could challenge them in court. I also found something else in the records, a memo from the HOA attorney to the board, dated 3 months earlier. The memo was partially redacted, but the visible portion warned the board that selective enforcement of parking rules could expose the association to liability. The memo specifically mentioned the need for consistent application of guest parking limits and decal requirements. The memo was signed by the attorney and marked as confidential board communication. Karen's name appeared in the CC line. The court hearing for the injunction was scheduled for Friday morning. Karen escalated again on Thursday night. I was walking to my car after work and found a tow truck backed into the spot next to mine. The driver was hooking a chain to the undercarriage of my sedan. The wheel clamp was still on, and the driver was working around it. I ran over and asked what he was doing. He said he had a tow order from the HOA. I asked to see the order. He showed me a printed form with the HOA letterhead and my unit number. The form said the vehicle had been abandoned in violation of parking rules and was authorized for immediate towing. I called the police. The dispatcher said an officer was on the way. I called Andrea. She said to take photos and do not let the driver leave with the vehicle. I stood in front of the tow truck and told the driver I was not letting him leave. He said I was interfering with a lawful tow and he would call the police himself. I said the police were already on the way. He shrugged and kept working on the chain. Karen showed up 2 minutes later. She was carrying her clipboard and her stack of orange cones. She walked up to the driver and handed him a folded piece of paper. She said I was trespassing on HOA property and obstructing a compliance action. I told her I lived here and this was my assigned carport. She said my lease was under review due to repeated violations and I should consider this a final warning. The police arrived while Karen was still talking. A single cruiser pulled into the lot and an officer stepped out with a notepad. He asked what was going on. Karen launched into a prepared speech. She said I had been violating parking rules for weeks, that the HOA had issued multiple notices, that I had refused to comply, and that the board had authorized towing as a last resort. She handed the officer a folder full of orange hangers and printed logs. I handed the officer my folder. I had photos, the dispatch logs from Ray, the witness statements, the records response from the management company, and the attorney memo. I explained that I was parked in my assigned spot, that the HOA had been selectively enforcing rules against me, and that I had a court hearing scheduled for the next morning to challenge the wheel clamp. The officer reviewed both folders, then walked over to my car and checked the carport number against my unit address. He checked my windshield decal. He walked to the guest lot 2 rows over and checked the signage. The officer came back and told the tow driver to unhook the chain. He said the vehicle was in an assigned spot with a valid decal and there was no lawful basis for towing. The driver argued that he had a signed order from the HOA. The officer said the order was not sufficient without proof of a violation. He told the driver to leave or he would cite him for unlawful towing. The driver unhooked the chain, muttered something about wasted time, and drove off. Karen started yelling. She said the officer was interfering with HOA business and she would file a complaint with the police chief. The officer told her to calm down. She said she would not calm down, that I was in violation, and that the board had the authority to enforce parking rules. The officer asked her if she had any evidence that my vehicle was parked illegally. She pointed at the wheel clamp and said the clamp was proof of violation. The officer said the clamp was not proof of anything, and if the HOA wanted to tow a vehicle from an assigned spot, they needed a court order. Karen said she did not need a court order, she had board authority. The officer said that was not how it worked. Karen raised her voice and said, "I do not care what you think, I care what the rule says." The officer wrote something in his notepad and told Karen he was documenting the interaction as a harassment complaint. He handed me an incident number and said I could reference it in my court hearing. Karen repeated her threat from earlier, word for word, "I will bury you in notices until you run out of printer ink." This time, the officer was standing 3 feet away and heard every word. He wrote it down and asked Karen if she was threatening me. She said she was not threatening anyone, she was enforcing HOA rules. The officer told her that repeated, baseless complaints could constitute harassment under Oregon law, and if I filed a restraining order, this incident would be part of the record. Karen stormed off. The officer told me to document everything and show up to court the next morning. He said the wheel clamp was still an issue and I should bring the incident report to the hearing. He left, and I stood in the parking lot with my car still clamped and my hands shaking. Marcus walked over from the gatehouse and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. He said he had been recording the whole interaction from the gatehouse camera. He said the camera angle covered the parking lot and the audio was clear. He offered to send me the footage. That night, I reviewed the footage with Andrea over a video call. The recording showed Karen approaching the tow driver, handing him the folded paper, and then standing off to the side while he hooked the chain. It showed her handing the officer the folder of orange hangers. It showed her yelling and pointing. Most importantly, it captured her repeating the threat, "I will bury you in notices until you run out of printer ink." Andrea said the recording was admissible and would be critical in the hearing. She also said Karen's behavior could be evidence of intentional infliction of emotional distress, which would open the door to damages. The court hearing the next morning was brief. I presented my evidence. Andrea argued that the wheel clamp was an improper enforcement action taken without notice or a hearing, and that the HOA was selectively targeting me in violation of its own rules. The judge reviewed the evidence, including the video from Marcus and the officer's incident report. He issued an emergency order requiring the HOA to remove the wheel clamp within 24 hours and prohibiting any further towing or immobilization actions until the full hearing. The full hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, the management company sent me an email saying the wheel clamp would be removed by end of business that day. It was removed by a locksmith at 4 p.m. No apology, no explanation. Just a guy with a grinder who cut the lock and took the clamp away. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the full hearing. Andrea subpoenaed the HOA's financial records. We wanted to see if there was a pattern of selective enforcement tied to budget shortfalls or vendor kickbacks. The management company fought the subpoena, but the judge ordered them to comply. They delivered another 200-page PDF, this time with fewer redactions. The financial records showed something stunning. Over the past year, the HOA had paid All Hours Towing over $40,000 in towing and immobilization fees. The contract with All Hours included a revenue sharing clause. The HOA received 15% of all impound fees collected from residents. That was illegal under Oregon law. Towing contracts could not include kickbacks or revenue sharing arrangements that created an incentive to over-enforce parking rules. The records also showed that Karen had personally approved every towing invoice. As pool and amenities chair, she had signature authority over vendor payments up to $5,000 per month. The towing invoices were bundled into monthly payments just under that threshold. Andrea said it looked like Karen was structuring the payments to avoid board oversight. We also found a smoking gun, an email from Karen to the management company dated 2 months earlier, in which she proposed increasing parking enforcement to generate additional revenue for pool upgrades. The email specifically mentioned targeting guest parking violations and overnight stays. It included a projected revenue estimate based on a 10% increase in towing actions. The management company had responded with a cautionary note about selective enforcement, but Karen had replied saying the board had the authority to enforce rules as written. Andrea called me the night before the hearing and said we had enough to win. She said the combination of selective enforcement, illegal revenue sharing, and Karen's documented threats created a clear pattern of abuse. She also said we could pursue damages for the lost wages, the locksmith fees, the attorney fees, and emotional distress. I told her I just wanted it to be over. She said it would be over soon, and Karen was going to face consequences. The hearing was held in a conference room at the county courthouse. The board president, the management company representative, and Karen were all present. Karen was wearing her gray blazer and carrying a leather folio. She looked calm and prepared. The board president looked uncomfortable. The management company rep looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Andrea presented our case first. She walked through the timeline, the orange hangers, the fabricated violations, the wheel clamp, the tow attempt, the police report, the illegal revenue sharing contract, and the email proposing increased enforcement for revenue. She played the video from Marcus showing Karen threatening me in front of the police officer. She entered Ray's dispatch logs showing Karen's repeated requests for unlawful towing. She entered the witness statements from neighbors and the delivery driver. The judge asked the HOA to respond. The board president started to speak, but the management company rep interrupted and said he needed to consult with the HOA attorney. The judge gave them 5 minutes. They stepped into the hallway. When they came back, the rep said the board had not been aware of the revenue sharing clause in the towing contract, and the board had not authorized the wheel clamp or the tow attempt. He said those actions were taken by Karen acting alone. Karen exploded. She stood up and said the board had authorized everything, that the minutes reflected it, and that she was following the rules. The judge asked to see the minutes. The rep handed over a binder. The judge reviewed the minutes and said there was no record of any board vote authorizing a wheel clamp or a tow on my vehicle. Karen said the votes were taken in executive session and were confidential. The judge said executive session votes had to be documented and could not be used to authorize enforcement actions against individual residents. Andrea then dropped the final piece, the trump card. She asked the judge for permission to submit a supplemental exhibit. The judge agreed. Andrea handed over a forensic audit report that I had commissioned through a private investigator. The audit showed that over the past 18 months, Karen had approved vendor payments totaling over $90,000, $15,000 of which had been routed to a personal account belonging to her husband. The payments were disguised as maintenance reimbursements and clubhouse improvement fees. The audit traced the payments through bank records and showed a clear pattern of embezzlement. I submit it as a formal exhibit at the hearing and watched Karen's face change. She went pale, then red. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. The board president looked at the management company rep. The rep looked at the judge. The judge said he was suspending the hearing and referring the matter to the district attorney's office for investigation. He said the HOA was ordered to refund all fines and fees I had paid, remove any negative records from my file, and cease all enforcement actions against me pending the outcome of the investigation. Andrea asked the judge to order the HOA to issue a public apology and a clarification of the parking rules. The judge agreed. He said the HOA had 30 days to issue a memo clarifying the rules Karen had weaponized and to distribute it to all residents. He also ordered the board to hold an emergency meeting to review Karen's role and take appropriate action. The hearing ended. Karen left the room without speaking. The board president approached me in the hallway and said he was sorry that he had not known what was going on and that the board would be taking immediate action. I told him I appreciated that, and I expected the refunds and the memo within the 30-day deadline. 3 days later, I received an email from the management company. The email said the board had held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Karen from her position as pool and amenities chair. The email also said the board had terminated the contract with All Hours Towing and was negotiating a new contract with a different vendor that did not include revenue-sharing provisions. The email included an apology for the harassment and the improper enforcement actions. 2 weeks later, the HOA issued a memo to all residents clarifying the guest parking rules. The memo explained that guests were allowed to park overnight for up to 72 hours with a valid pass, that passes were available for free at the management office, and that enforcement actions required written notice and a hearing before any fines or towing. The memo also clarified that wheel clamps could only be used in emergency situations involving public safety, not for routine parking violations. The district attorney's office opened an investigation into the embezzlement allegations. 6 weeks later, Karen and her husband were charged with theft and fraud. The charges were based on the forensic audit and additional evidence gathered by the DA's investigators. Karen pleaded no contest to a reduced charge and was ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and serve 200 hours of community service. Her husband pleaded guilty to conspiracy and received probation. The funny karma moment came during a public meeting where the board presented the new parking enforcement policy. A resident stood up and asked how the board planned to prevent future abuses. The board president said they were implementing a new policy requiring all enforcement actions to be reviewed by the management company and approved by a majority of the board before any fines or towing. Another resident asked if there would be any refunds for residents who had been improperly fined under the old policy. The board president said yes, the HOA was issuing automatic refunds to everyone hit in the enforcement wave. A third resident asked if the minutes from the past year would be reviewed. The board president hesitated, then said the minutes were being audited by the HOA attorney. A fourth resident, an older man who lived near the clubhouse, stood up and read from a printed email. It was Karen's threat, "I will bury you in notices until you run out of printer ink." The man said his daughter had received the same threat 2 years earlier when she complained about pool access. The room went silent. The board president said he was not aware of that incident. The man said it was documented in an email to the management company, and he had a copy if the board wanted to see it. A public meeting moment where the minutes turn against Karen became the lasting image of the entire saga. The HOA eventually settled with 3 other residents who came forward with similar complaints. The settlements were confidential, but the board issued a public statement acknowledging that enforcement actions over the past 2 years had not been consistent with HOA policy and apologizing for any harm caused. The statement also announced that the board had hired a new management company and implemented a resident advisory committee to oversee compliance actions. The investigation into the embezzlement led to a deeper audit of the HOA finances. The audit revealed that Karen had been skimming funds for over 3 years, totaling nearly $200,000. The HOA filed a civil lawsuit to recover the funds. The case was settled out of court, with Karen and her husband agreeing to pay back half the amount over 5 years and surrendering their property in the community. They moved out 3 months later. I stayed in Maplewood Commons Terrace. My reputation was restored, and several neighbors apologized for not speaking up earlier. Marcus, the security guard, became a close friend. Ray, the tow driver, started referring other residents to Andrea when they had HOA disputes. The delivery driver who had witnessed Karen's antics stopped by one day with a bottle of wine and said he was glad someone finally stood up to her. The bright orange violation door hangers disappeared. The guest lot stayed open, and the cones were never seen again. The gatehouse got new cameras, and Marcus made sure they stayed on. The HOA attorney sent a letter to the board recommending a comprehensive review of all vendor contracts and enforcement policies. The letter was copied to all residents and posted on the community website. Karen got corrected by the HOA attorney in plain language in a follow-up memo that was distributed to the entire community. The memo outlined the legal limits on enforcement actions, the requirements for notice and hearings, and the prohibition on revenue-sharing arrangements. The memo specifically noted that board members could not act unilaterally to impose fines, order towing, or approve vendor payments without board approval. The memo concluded by stating that any future violations of these policies would result in removal from the board and potential legal action. The HOA board held a special election to fill Karen's vacated seat. A retired attorney who lived near the tennis courts ran on a platform of transparency and accountability. She won by a landslide and immediately pushed for a policy requiring all board meetings to be recorded and posted online. The policy passed, and the recordings became a model for other HOAs in the area. I never saw Karen again. A neighbor told me she had moved to another state and was working in retail. Her husband took a plea deal that included restitution and probation. The civil lawsuit dragged on for 2 more years, but eventually the HOA recovered most of the stolen funds. The board used the money to upgrade the pool facilities and install new security cameras throughout the community. Andrea and I stayed in touch. She used my case as a reference example in her HOA law practice and sent me occasional updates on other clients facing similar harassment. She told me that selective enforcement and illegal revenue sharing were more common than people realized, and that most residents did not fight back because they did not know their rights. I kept my folded tow yard receipt packet in a sleeve as a reminder. I never had to use it again, but it sat in my glove box for years as a symbol of the fight. The chalk mark on my tire eventually faded, and the wheel clamp never returned. The tow truck never backed into my carport again. Looking back, the entire ordeal lasted 3 months from the first orange hanger to the final settlement. It felt like a year. I lost sleep, lost wages, and nearly lost my job. But I also learned that HOAs depend on residents staying quiet and accepting abuse. The moment I started documenting and pushing back, the whole structure began to crack. Karen was not an isolated bad actor. She was enabled by a system that prioritized revenue over fairness and control over community. The outcome was clear. Karen was removed from the board in an emergency meeting, and the bogus tow and immobilization fees were automatically refunded to everyone hit in the enforcement wave. The policy changes and the criminal charges sent a message to other board members and other HOAs in the area. Selective enforcement, illegal contracts, and harassment would not be tolerated. I also learned the value of allies. Marcus risked his job to help me. Ray risked his business relationship with the HOA. Andrea took my case when I had no money and no leverage. The neighbors who gave witness statements put themselves on Karen's radar and still spoke up. The delivery driver and the older man at the meeting added their voices when it mattered. I could not have won alone. The cloudy sky that had threatened a storm on the day of the tow attempt eventually cleared. The porch lights in the background of that chaotic scene became a comforting glow again. The neighborhood returned to a quieter rhythm, and the parking lot became just a parking lot instead of a battlefield. I still see the guest spots filled with cars, and I still see gate fobs held at the reader, but there are no shaking hands and no chalk-marked tires. Thanks for watching, and thanks for all the support.